Welcome to the podcast. Champ and Flawless present the picks, Week 2 college football. Hey, and welcome to the show. I thought we'd have a little recap of last week's college pick'em contest. Number 1 last week was I'm Too Good for a team named Greg, who went 7-2-1 to start off in first place right off the gate. Really went heavy with the high favorites, East Carolina, Kansas State, Nebraska, Baylor, and a couple others thrown in there to get the wins. Coming in at second place in our college pick'em contest, he went 7-3. Also went with the strategy of the high spread. Also went with the strategy of the high spreads. Notre Dame, Texas, Oregon, Michigan State, Nebraska, Missouri, and Ohio State. Most of those covered, which led to his great record. Lots of luck this week. We'll see if you all can catch up to the leaders outside the gate. Now let's get to the picks for this week, Week 2 college football. We open up in the SEC with Arkansas State visiting Tennessee. Tennessee's a 17-point favorite. Hard to get a read on Tennessee here. Didn't look like Utah State had much to offer last week. Chucky Keaton didn't look very healthy. I thought the Vols defense played pretty well. Still a little suspect on the offensive end. But I didn't like the way Arkansas State played last week, like the Vols minus the 17. We go to our second game, Western Illinois versus Wisconsin. Wisconsin's a 37-point favorite, and Wisconsin becomes my black spot team of the week. I didn't like what I saw from Wisconsin last week. That's why they're my black spot team of the week. I think direct death is surrounding this team. The weird thing going on with Stave, the quarterback they have in there now can't throw it all. Don't like the miss and match. Have a feeling this season could be a bad one. Snake bit for Wisconsin. The black spot team, Wisconsin. Watch them. Be careful the rest of the season taking them. Meanwhile, in this game, Western Illinois probably won't pose much of a threat, but the 37 points seems a little high. Gordon got a little nicked up in that game last week, so I don't look for them to cover that 30-point spread like Western Illinois. We move to Buffalo and Army. Army's a 3.5-point favorite. Like Army here, didn't think Buffalo played that well last week. Look for Armies to get that option attack going. Win this one, 3.5 Army. Florida Atlantic versus Alabama. Alabama's a 40-point favorite. Alabama could easily cover this, but I don't see them running up the score very high. I don't think Florida Atlantic will score very much, but the 40 seems a bit high, like Florida Atlantic plus the 40. Next we have Missouri versus Toledo. Toledo's a 3.5-point underdog. Like Toledo here, Missouri definitely did not show me a lot last week. And like I thought, their passing attack struggled. I think they really struggled going into Toledo here. Like the Rockets to come away with the win. Toledo plus the 3.5. Western Kentucky versus Illinois is our next game. Illinois is a 6-point favorite. Really like the way Western Kentucky played last week. Don't know if they can go into Illinois and win. Illinois seemed to get it together late in that game after a slow start. Like Illinois, minus the 6 in this game. Central Michigan visits Purdue. Purdue's a 3.5-point favorite. Purdue picking on the compass of Michigan schools. Last week was Western Michigan. This week is Central Michigan. Central Michigan played a pretty solid game last week. I think Purdue still pulls it out. They were able to score a lot on Western Michigan. Defense didn't show up. They gave up plenty of points. Look for it to be a bit of the same way this week. Purdue minus the 3.5. A showdown in the Northeast. Stony Brook versus Connecticut. Connecticut's a 16-point favorite. Don't really know much about Stony Brook, so I'm going to go with UConn minus the 16 here. Howard versus Rutgers is our next game. Rutgers minus 37. Like Rutgers to cover this big spread. Really like the way they went out into Washington last week. Took that game. Look for them to cruise here minus the 37. Oklahoma at Tulsa is our next game. 24.5 point favorites are Oklahoma. I look for Tulsa to put up a bit of a fight early in the first half. Second half, look for Oklahoma to roll this game. Easy cover by Oklahoma minus the 24.5. McNeese State versus Nebraska is our next game. Nebraska is a 34.5 point favorite. And I look for their rolling to continue off last week's Florida Atlantic game. Look for them to continue that up. Nebraska minus the 34.5. SMU versus North Texas is our next game. North Texas is a 2.5 point favorite. Really like the way they finished that Texas game. Think North Texas gets a win here. Thought Southern Methodist struggled a bit in that Baylor game. Didn't seem to get their offense on track at any point. And look for that to continue. Like North Texas, minus the 2.5. Kansas State versus Iowa State. Kansas State's a 12 point favorite on the road here. Really like Kansas State to cover big here. Iowa State got massacred by North Dakota State. They also lost their best receiver for the year. Sam Richardson got a little dinged up. I don't think Iowa State's going to have much to offer K-State. Look for K-State to roll minus the 12. Akron versus Penn State. Penn State's a 14.5 point favorite here. Maybe a little jet lag traveling back off from Ireland. Akron played pretty well last week. Penn State pulled out a win over Central Florida at the last second. Nice way to start the Penn State era for James Franklin. Look for Penn State to cover the 14.5. Still don't think Akron's playing to the level of these big schools yet to give them a claim. South Carolina State versus Clemson. Clemson minus 35. Thought Clemson rolled over a bit last week, so look for them to roll over South Carolina State this week. Really pile up the points, see if they can find a rhythm for that offense, which seemed to lose its rhythm in the second half. Navy visits Temple. Navy's a 3 point favorite this week. Like Navy to roll in this one. They really played Ohio State really tough. The score is not indicative of how that game played out. Think Navy goes into Temple rolls here. I like that option attack. Thought the defense played really well versus Ohio State. Look for them to blow out Temple here. South Alabama and Kent State. South Alabama played good football last year. Lots expected of them to contend for the Sun Belt this year. Do not like them going into Kent. Like Kent plus the 3. Kent played a tough game last week. And I look for them to regroup this week. UAB versus Mississippi State. Mississippi State minus 27.5 points. Mississippi State rolled and piled on the points last week, but UAB also rolled and piled on the points versus Troy last week. Thought UAB played well. Look for them to cover this 27.5 point spread. New Mexico State and Georgia State play each other. The pillow fight of the week. In the pillow fight of the week, it's a pick'em. Georgia State struggled, but got the win versus Alvin Christensen last week. New Mexico State also struggled, but got the win versus, I believe it was a Cal Poly, one of those Cal teams. I think New Mexico State might have the better players. Did not like what I saw from Georgia State last week. Look for a big road win for New Mexico State and them to start the year 2-0 in the pillow fight of the week. Colorado and UMass is our next game. Colorado is a 17 point favorite. UMass once again struggled to start the season. Look for the struggles to continue. Colorado did not look good versus Colorado State, but they get off the schneid, get a win here, cruise pretty big versus UMass. Colorado minus the 17. Sacramento State versus California is our next game. Cal's a 24-point favorite. Cal went into Northwestern, rolled just like I told you they would last week. Look for that offense to continue rolling versus Sacramento State. California minus the 24. Fresno State versus our Utah game. Fresno State versus Utah, minus 10.5 for Utah. This is my lock of the week. Fresno State struggled last week versus USC, just like I thought they would. I think this team's really in for a down year. That's why I'm making Utah, who put up a bunch of points, like the way that offense retooled last week. Utah minus the 10.5, lock of the week. Next we have USC versus Stanford in an early Pac-12 matchup. Stanford's a 2.5-point favorite. Going with the Cardinals here. Tough to gauge these two teams right now. Both replacing a lot of guys. But I think Stanford rolls at home. I don't know if USC can bring that same type of offense versus Stanford, even if they are retooling the defense. Really like the offense Stanford ran last week. Look for them to win this one late versus USC, and usually a great game. Ohio versus Kentucky. Kentucky's a 13-point favorite. Kentucky rolled last week versus Tennessee Martin. Another easy game this week, not quite as easy. Kentucky's 13-point favorites. Look for that offense to continue to roll until next week versus Florida, like Kentucky minus the 13. Northern Illinois versus Northwestern. Northwestern's a 7-point favorite. Like Northern Illinois to go in there and roll. Was not impressed with Northwestern last week. They struggled much like I thought they would. Look for their struggles to continue, and Northern Illinois to get a Big Ten victory for the MAC. Next up is our not such a cupcake game. Washington scheduled Eastern Washington this week, probably thinking it would be a cupcake. Turns out Eastern Washington, #1 ranked team in the FCS. I don't think they got what they bargained for. Washington's a 14-point favorite. Like Eastern Washington to go in there, cover that 14. Washington coming back from a Hawaii trip where they did not even play well in that game. Eastern Washington plus 14, not such a cupcake game of the week. Next we have Ball State and Iowa. Iowa's a 17.5-point favorite. Ball State played good football last week. Iowa did not play good football last week. Struggled to beat Northern Iowa. But they usually struggle in that game. Northern Iowa seems to give Iowa and Iowa State problems. The offense came around late, but the defense struggled. Look for Ball State to cover that 17.5-point spread like the MAC again versus Iowa. Not to win this one, but I think they'll cover. Richmond plays Virginia. Virginia's a 14-point favorite. Gotta feel bad for Virginia. If they hadn't made those turnovers, they would have pulled the upset versus UCLA. UCLA's offense only scored 7 points, but got 3 defensive touchdowns to pull that game out. Really like that quarterback they put in the second quarter. Look for Virginia to get off the schneid, roll this game without those turnovers. Next up is our warning team of the week. Be careful, watch out. Bowling Green just lost Matt Johnson. Dave Clawson's loss seemed to affect them a lot more than anyone think they would. They really struggled in that Western Kentucky game with Matt Johnson gone for the season. I think this Bowling Green team is very close to pitching tent, rolling over for the rest of the season in what was expected a team to contend for the MAC title. Watch them, study them the next couple weeks, because I think they're ready to roll. Warning team of the week. Meanwhile, Bowling Green plays VMI this week. I don't think they'll have too much trouble. 42.5 points does seem like a lot. Not taking them for that many. VMI plus the 42.5. Next we have Eastern Kentucky versus Miami, Ohio. Miami, Ohio is a 5-point favorite. Like Eastern Kentucky to roll here. Don't think Miami of Ohio has much to offer. They were brutal last week. Eastern Kentucky's a pretty solid FCS team. Look for them to hold the upset here, like Eastern Kentucky +5. Missouri State visits Oklahoma State -32. Oklahoma State played good football last week. Defense looked pretty solid. Thought the offense had sparks. Look for them to find some cohesiveness on the offensive end this week. Oklahoma State -32. Maryland versus South Florida. South Florida's a 12.5-point underdog this week, and this makes this my upset pick of the week. Like South Florida in this game. Really like the way that running back ran last week. Think that defense will slow down that Maryland attack and be able to grind away yards, eat up the clock, maybe steal this upset. That's why I'm taking South Florida +12.5, my upset pick of the week. Middle Tennessee versus Minnesota. Minnesota's a -16-point favorite. Middle Tennessee cruised last week to a monster victory. Not going to be as easy this week. Minnesota played pretty good football versus a good FCS team in Eastern Illinois. I think they hold off Middle Tennessee, but look for a bit of a shootout here, so that 16 is going to be a hard one to cover, like Middle Tennessee plus the 16. Next we have our cupcake of the week. Florida opened its schedule last week versus Idaho, which got postponed, and this week they now schedule the lame duck Eastern Michigan. Just want to send a shout out to Florida. Way to open the season tough, hard, get those reps in. Florida cupcake of the week. Florida's a 37.5-point favorite versus the brutal Eastern Michigan. I still don't trust this Florida team to be able to score enough. Look for Eastern Michigan to cover the 37.5, even as bad as they are. Georgia Tech versus Tulane. Tulane's getting 10 points. Really didn't like what I saw from Georgia Tech last week. Really struggled versus a walkover opponent. Liked what I saw from Tulane, bringing them back home. Think they give Georgia Tech a little bit of a tough ride, like Tulane, plus the 10. Next we have Nicholls State versus Arkansas. Arkansas is a 39.5-point favorite. Like the Razorbacks to roll here. Don't think Nicholls State will have much to offer. Did not like the way Arkansas rolled over after the storm hit and the big delay. I know that's tough to do on the road, but they totally just quit in that game. But look for them to pile on the points versus an easy rollover opponent here in Nicholls State. Arkansas minus the 39.5. We go to Ole Miss versus Vandy. Ole Miss is a 20-point favorite. Vandy really looked bad last week. Think they're going to struggle all year. So look for their struggles to continue versus Ole Miss, who goes on the road and rolls this week. Ole Miss minus the 20. Next we have Wagner at FIU. FIU's a 13.5-point favorite. Don't think Wagner can offer up much versus FIU. Look for FIU to roll minus 13.5. Campbell visits Appalachian State. Appalachian State's a 38.5-point favorite. Campbell's not a very good team, but I struggle to think how Appalachian State's going to win by almost 40 points. Think Campbell able to cover the big spread. Campbell plus the 38.5. Old Dominion versus NC State. NC State's a 17-point spread. NC State really looked bad last week. Barely pulled out a victory. Old Dominion played pretty solid football. I think NC State gets it together this week, dominates this one. Think Old Dominion struggles to stop NC State. NC State minus the 17. We have Savannah State versus Georgia Southern. Georgia Southern is a 43-point favorite. I'm going to go against Savannah State. Really like the offense Georgia Southern brought to the table last week. Think they pile on the points. Cruise easy. Georgia Southern 43. And now our game of the week. Michigan State visits Oregon. Oregon's a 12-point favorite. Great game to start. Great game for the second week of the season. Defensive team versus an offensive team. Oregon in the past has had trouble with these slow down, grinded out defensive teams. I think those struggles continue, like Michigan State plus the 12 in our game of the week. Gardner-Webb versus Wake Forest. Wake Forest is 22-point favorites. Wake Forest really struggled to score versus Law Monroe, but I don't think they'll have those issues this week. Look for them to cruise in this game versus Gardner-Webb. Wake Forest minus 22. East Carolina visits South Carolina. South Carolina is a 16.5-point favorite. Look for the points to pile often and heavy in this game, though I don't think South Carolina's defense will be able to contain East Carolina enough to cover this large spread. Look for East Carolina to cover this. East Carolina plus the 16.5. Louisiana Tech versus UL Lafayette. Lafayette's a 14-point favorite. Really like Lafayette this year. Look, I didn't think Louisiana Tech looked good last week, and I look for Lafayette to dominate them this week. Lafayette minus the 14. Idaho, off their cancellation with Florida last week, now gets to go visit UL Monroe. UL Monroe's a 14-point favorite. UL Monroe's defense really shut down Wake Forest last week. Think they shut down Idaho this week. Cover the 14, UL Monroe. Alcorn State visits Southern Miss. Southern Miss a 17-point favorite. And I think Southern Miss gets a win early in the year this year. Southern Miss minus 17. Look for them to cruise versus Alcorn State. Duke visits Troy. Duke's a 19-point favorite. Look for Duke to cruise here. Put up the points pretty good last week. Defense looked pretty solid. Troy struggled on the road versus UAB. Look for them to struggle again this week. Duke minus 19. San Jose State comes from Northern California to visit Auburn this week. Auburn minus 31. Auburn will score often, and their poor defense will not really come into play this week. Like Auburn, minus the 31. Murray State versus Louisville. Louisville's a 36.5-point favorite. Louisville looked shaky, but they made plays to win on Monday versus Miami. I think this spread's pretty easy cover. Murray State didn't look very good last week. Louisville looks to get their offense together this week. I thought Louisville's defense played pretty solid, especially when their offense put them in bad situations. Look for Louisville to cruise minus the 36.5. Arizona visits New Mexico. New Mexico's getting 25 points. Arizona State goes in here, rolls New Mexico pretty good. New Mexico struggled last week. Arizona State scores early, often, and a lot. Arizona State minus the 25. FAMU visits Miami. Miami's a 42-point favorite. Don't think FAMU has much to offer. Look for Miami to keep its starters in pretty deep into the game to try to find some offensive cohesion. Look for Miami to roll minus the 42. Southeast Missouri State visits Kansas. Kansas is a 26-point favorite. Like Kansas to roll here. Don't think Southeast Missouri State can play with Kansas. Kansas needs wins. This is a chance to get wins. Look for them to score a lot of points. Kansas minus 26. Rhode Island visits Marshall. Marshall will score a lot. Rhode Island won't score a lot. Marshall covers the 43. BYU visits Texas. Texas minus 3.5-point favorites. Have no clue how Texas is favored in this game. Lose their quarterback. Lose a handful of offensive linemen. BYU thrashed them last year. Look for BYU to continue to thrash them this year. BYU plus the 3.5. Next we have Lamar versus Texas A&M. Texas A&M is 49-point favorites. A lot of points, and Texas A&M will score a lot of points, but I think they call off the dogs early. Don't think they cover 49, like Lamar plus 49. Townsend goes to West Virginia. West Virginia's 28-point favorites. West Virginia played a solid game versus Alabama last week. The defense didn't look as brutal as it usually does, so look for them to slow Townsend down. Look for the points to come in bunches. West Virginia minus the 28. Citadel at Florida State. Florida State minus 55. Florida State will score a lot. Citadel will not score any. Florida State minus 55. Michigan State versus Notre Dame. Notre Dame is a 3.5-point favorite. Tough game to call here. Both teams had solid opening weeks versus opponents they were supposed to have solid opening weeks versus. Don't have a great read in this game. Thought Golston looked pretty good. Actually was throwing the ball pretty well, which is a change from when he played 2 years ago. So I'll lean towards Notre Dame at home here, minus the 3.5. Northwestern State versus Baylor. Baylor's a 48-point favorite. I think you know the drill here. Northwestern State won't score many. Baylor will score a lot. Baylor minus the 48. Sam Houston State versus Louisiana State. LSU is a 34-point favorite. Sam Houston State usually has a pretty solid program. Didn't like the way LSU scored last week, so look for Sam Houston State to be able to cover that 34. Like Sam Houston State plus the 34. Grambling State versus Houston. Houston's a 51.5-point favorite. Houston will score a lot. Grambling's one of the worst football programs in FBS or FCS. Look for Houston to roll, minus the 51.5. We have Idaho State versus Utah State. Utah State's a 36-point favorite. I can't take Utah State with 36 this week, even as bad as Idaho State is. Just didn't like the way their offense looked. It looked slow. Chucky Keaton looked slow. The line looked confused, and their receivers made a whole lot of drops. Don't think they can cover that 36. Idaho State plus the 36. San Diego State versus North Carolina is our next game. North Carolina's a 15.5-point favorite. Tough for San Diego State to come all the way across country, but I think they do it. North Carolina was hot and cold versus Liberty. They did not end up covering that game, and it was a pretty close game late into the third quarter. I think San Diego State can play with North Carolina a bit. North Carolina seems to have trouble with these teams like San Diego State plus the 15.5. Virginia Tech visits Ohio State. Ohio State is an 11-point favorite. Well, Virginia Tech played pretty well last week, didn't get tripped up, which they usually struggle versus some of those FCS teams in their local area. They played well, which seems to be a good sign. Ohio State I did not think looked good. They made a couple of plays late when Navy tired down. Their defense looked to play all right and physical. Don't think much of that offense. Think Virginia Tech's defense shuts down Ohio State's offense, and the Hokies find a way to grind out a couple points there, like Virginia Tech plus the 11. Northern Colorado visits UNLV. UNLV's a 28-point favorite. Think UNLV will be able to score in this game, maybe get their offense right, but I don't think UNLV will have a very good year. Look for them to win this game and struggle the rest of the year, like UNLV minus the 28. Memphis is visiting UCLA. UCLA is a 24-point favorite. Think UCLA back home, not 3 time zones over, starting at 12 in the morning. Will get back in their comfort zone this week. Think Memphis will struggle going to the West Coast. Look for UCLA to get on track and roll this week, minus the 24. We have Air Force visiting Wyoming. Air Force is a 2.5-point favorite. Like Air Force going into Wyoming, Wyoming struggled with Montana and just barely put them away in a rain-delayed game. Like Air Force going in there, running it up on Wyoming. Air Force minus the 2.5. Colorado State visits Boise State. Boise State's a 10.5-point favorite. Boise State once again struggled in the red zone, could not score touchdowns, and even turned it over a couple times. Didn't like the way that Boise State team looked. Thought the defense looked pretty good until it wore down. Colorado State played a great game in Colorado. I look for them to come in here, try to pull this upset. I think 10.5 is a little too many points, like Colorado State plus the 10.5. Oregon State goes to Hawaii. Hawaii's a 10.5-point favorite. Look for Oregon State to score a lot of points. I don't see them having the same problems as Washington did. Look for Oregon State goes in there, rolls early, piles on the points. Oregon State minus the 10.5. And our last game on the slate is Texas Tech versus UTEP. UTEP played mildly okay. Their running back is what carried them to victory. I don't think they have this much luck playing versus Texas Tech this week, even though Texas Tech struggled a bit last week. Look for them to cover this 20.5-point spread like Texas Tech. Well, those are my picks for this week. Now let me give you my college pick'em 10 picks of the week. We're going to go with Toledo, BYU, Utah, Kansas State, Eastern Washington, Michigan State, South Florida, Ole Miss, Oregon State, and Virginia Tech. Those are my 10. Be sure to check out our college pick'em contest and see just how those picks go out. Hope you enjoyed the podcast, and I'm out.